And now we come back to the other international spaces that we started dealing with if you have no questions on the case. Okay. Then we go back to the other international spaces. We have been dealing with airspace, and now we concentrate on outer space. The use, yes, please. A genuine link the convention does not specify what a genuine link is, but a genuine link can be given by the fact, for example, that the owner of the ship has the nationality of the state, or by the fact that the majority of the crew has the nationality of the state, or the fact that, it could be anything, the fact that the ship is mainly harbored in a port of the state. So there needs to be links with that state which facilitate the adoption by that state of control measures on that ship, administrative and social control in administrative and social matters. You're welcome. Now, the exploration of outer space, as you all know, started in 1957 with the launch of the first Soviet satellite, Sputnik. And we may say that a customary rule of international law was rapidly formed in relation to the regime of outer space, because no state reacted when the first satellites were sent in outer space. And this means that, in fact, states were convinced of the fact that outer space was free for exploration and use by all states. They didn't think that a satellite overflying their territory was breaching their sovereignty. Therefore, we may say that since the first satellite launches, the rule on the freedom of outer space emerged. Anyway, the customary rules relating to the use of outer space were codified within the United Nations in a rather a quick period of time. 5 treaties were adopted between 1967 and 1979. But the most important of these treaties is the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, which is known as the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It is the first and the most important of all these treaties because it contains all the general principles relating to the use of outer space. So it is a sort of constitution relating to the use of outer space. Now, use of outer space, of course, means everything. It means activities, mainly, of course, activities in orbit around the Earth. You know that there are all kinds of satellites orbiting around the Earth, telecommunication satellites, observation satellites, remote sensing. Do you know what is remote sensing? What is remote sensing? It is all the satellites that are observing, in fact, the Earth, and observing with different means, not necessarily with optical means, but catching information from the Earth by observing, sensing from remote, so that is why it's called remote sensing, because it is observation, it is the catching of information from remote area, from the orbits. And then you have the navigation satellites, you have the meteorological satellites, all sorts of activities which are essential to current life on Earth. But then you have, of course, all the activities of exploration of of the moon and other celestial bodies also. Now, the Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty provides that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind, which would mean that, in fact, all activities should be conducted for the common good. But this provision has not had many applications. Concrete applications. I think it is, however, important in indicating at least that when you have limited resources in outer space, they cannot be used in a way to exhaust them, which is anyway connected to the rule on freedom, because freedom is has always a limit. The limit is the respect of the equal freedom of the others. So you cannot exhaust a limited resource by using your freedom. Anyway, the main rule is outer space shall be free for exploration and use by all states. And outer space, Article 2, including all celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation. So the regime is analogous to which regime? Of the high seas, exactly. It is the same kind of regime that applies on the high seas and that applies in the airspace above the high seas. No appropriation and freedom for all states to explore and use while respecting the equal freedom of the other states. Now, we have a question now, because a series of states are, and not only states, also private entities, we will see what is the rule for private entities in space, are projecting the exploitation of resources on celestial bodies. It is not something that is taking place now, but there are clear projects to go on celestial bodies and sooner or later start the exploitation of resources. So, for example, mineral activities, mineral recovery of minerals, of water and of minerals from celestial bodies. Now, this activity has no express regulation in the treaties. However, it is doubtful whether, well, there is an express regulation, but there is a regulation in the Moon Treaty of 1979, which in fact provides that the Moon and other celestial bodies are the common heritage of humankind, which would be a regime analogous to that of the deep sea bed. And it provides for the creation of an international regime for the exploitation of resources. However, the problem with the Moon Treaty of 1979 is that it has not been ratified by all the main space powers. It has only been ratified by a limited number of states, and none of them is one of the important space powers. So the Moon Treaty is not effective. Therefore, one has to look at the Outer Space Treaty, and in the Outer Space Treaty, you don't find any regulation for the activity of exploitation of space resources. However, it is doubtful whether the exploitation of space resources is compatible with the provision on the prohibition of national appropriation of outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, because think of an activity of, for example, an asteroid is a celestial body. If you exploit the resources of an asteroid, you can even exhaust the asteroid. You can exhaust a comet by exploiting its resources. How is that compatible with the prohibition of national appropriation? So there is a problem with some laws in particular. One of these most relevant laws is the US law of 2015, and there are subsequent acts from the United States promoting the right of US citizens to engage in commercial exploration and commercial recovery of space resources free from harmful interference. So there is a possible legality problem of this law in relation to the Outer Space Treaty, although many tend to interpret the Outer Space Treaty now in the sense that it would not prohibit the exploitation of space resources. We are talking about outer space, but where does outer space begin? Where does the airspace end, and where does the outer space begin? The boundary between airspace and outer space has never been established. It has never been established because, first of all, there is not agreement on what is that boundary, on where is that boundary situated. But secondly, there is not even agreement on the need to establish a boundary. Why? Because some states say, well, all the air communication activities, all the air transport falls into the regime of the airspace. While the outer space activities, we know what they are, and they fall into the regime of outer space. So there is no need to establish a precise boundary between airspace and outer space. A functional delimitation is sufficient. Aircraft, air transport activities are functionally distinct from space transport activities, which is true to a certain point, because today we are assisting at some new activities whose categorization is not clear. What I'm referring to. Yes, those launches, tourist launches, that have started. Those tourist test launches, which have started by SpaceX or by Virgin Atlantic or by other companies. Launching those missiles, we can say that just do not enter into orbit, but transport people till an altitude of 100 or more kilometers, just to experiment a few moments in outer space and then going back to Earth. Now, without having a clear boundary between airspace and outer space, it is not clear whether these activities, these suborbital activities, they are called suborbital activities because these objects do not enter into orbit. Not because they reach an altitude below the orbit altitude, but because they do not enter into orbit. These suborbital activities, it is not clear whether they fit into the regime of outer space or the regime of airspace. So there is a clear problem today. Anyway, no agreement has been reached up till now about the delimitation of few states, except 100 kilometers altitude as a limit. What is clear is that objects in orbit around the Earth are in outer space. What is clear is that aircraft traveling around the Earth is in airspace. So the problem is only the precise altitude. The regime of space objects is analogous to that of the ships or that of the aircraft, because the treaties provide that space objects shall be registered. A space object shall be registered. A space object is an expression encompassing all objects launched into outer space. So whether they are satellites, whether they are space transportation vehicles, they are all space objects. Every space object shall be registered in the registry of one state. And this entails the exclusive jurisdiction of the state of registry. The outer space law does not speak about nationality or about a flag. However, the phenomenon is similar. We can say that substantially, from a substantial point of view, a space object registered in the registry of one state is a national space object of that state, even if that is not clarified in the treaties. There is also an international registry, which is held by the Secretary General of the United Nations, where all objects should be, every object launched in outer space should be notified by the launching states. And this registry, this international registry, has the purpose of publicizing of transparency on space activities, of rendering the presence of satellites in orbit known to all states and even to everybody, because everybody can open the page of the UNOOSA, United Nations Office on Outer Space Affairs, where the registry is published on the internet. So you find all the satellites launched by the different states. Now, the main provisions of the outer space regime are, first of all, there is a special regime for private activities in outer space. Because according to our Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, states parties bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space, including activities conducted by non-governmental entities, which means private activities. And the activities of the private activities in outer space shall require authorization by states and continuing supervision. This rule was a compromise between the US thesis when the regime, outer space regime, was born. It was created mainly by the United States and the Soviet Union, which were the two only superpowers, the two only space powers in the beginning. And this rule was a compromise because the United States would have liked a regime of total freedom for private entities to go up in outer space, while the Soviet Union wanted the prohibition of all private activities in outer space. The compromise was to establish that private entities may go into outer space, however, they shall be authorized by states, they shall be controlled by states, and states bear responsibility for the activities of private entities. This is an important exception to the common rule in international law. As we will see, normally a state is not responsible for private activities. While in this case, we may say that private activities are attributed to the state. Which state? The national state. Now, the national state means certainly the state whose citizens launch a space object or anyway conduct space activities. But it also means the state from whose territory a private space object is launched, which is even more important because obviously the territorial sovereign has more possibilities to control launching activities taking place from its territory than the national state if its nationals launch from another state. There is also a different regime for the case of damage caused by a space object. So think of a space object falling on the Earth and causing damage, or a space object colliding with another space object in orbit. Well, the Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, but more specifically the 1972 Liability Convention, Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, provides that the launching state is liable for the damage caused by a space object, and in case of damage caused on the surface of the Earth or to aircraft in flight, the liability is absolute, which means that the launching state is bound to pay compensation in every case. So even if it is not at fault in the production of that damage, the launching state is the state which launches a space object, or the state which pays another state to launch its space object, because, for example, Italy wants to launch a satellite, it will, for example, pay a launch on which is taking place from the United States, for example. And also the state from whose territory a space object is launched. So all these states, if they are different from each other, they may be liable for damage caused by space objects. And in outer space, the damage is due to the fault. So when there is a collision between space objects, the launching state will be liable only if it is at fault for the production of that damage. So there is this interesting regime of state liability for damage, which is not necessarily connected with a violation of international law. It is a regime based on the principle according to which it is the entity causing damage that shall pay compensation if damage is caused, independently of any, which does not mean that there is necessarily a violation of international law in the causing of that damage. Okay. If you have any doubt or any question, you can ask. There is a problem with space militarization. We have seen a very recent example, and we will talk about it in a moment. In fact, notwithstanding the provision we have seen in the beginning, according to which space shall be used for the benefit of all humankind, the military uses of outer space are not prohibited, even if the principle according to which space should be used for peaceful uses is always proclaimed, but peaceful use is often intended, normally intended as non-aggressive, which means you can use it for military purposes if you are not conducting aggressive activities. Anyway, the fact that space can be used for military purposes, for example, by using spying satellites, so-called spying satellites. You can use observation satellite for any purpose, so also to observe your enemies or your potential enemies, to observe their weapon systems, to observe their movements during a war. The satellites have played an extremely important role in all recent international conflicts, starting from the conflict in Iraq in 1991. The fact that these uses of space are lawful is proved by the fact that Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty only provides for some specific limits relating to the military uses of outer space. First of all, states are prohibited from placing in outer space objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, which means chemical and biological weapons. Nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons cannot be placed in outer space. They cannot be placed in orbit. They cannot be installed on celestial bodies. They cannot be placed permanently in space in any way, which, however, does not prohibit the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles to launch a nuclear weapon. Because an intercontinental ballistic missile, in its trajectory, it reaches outer space. It goes at an altitude of 1,500 kilometers, so it is fully outer space. But the reason why it does not fall into this prohibition is that it is not placed permanently in outer space. It is not placed in orbit in outer space because it may cross orbits, but it does not perform a complete orbit around the Earth in its trajectory. Therefore, obviously, you can understand that the main space powers didn't want to prohibit the use of ballistic missiles launching nuclear weapons, as the main space power coincide with the main nuclear powers. It is very important that celestial bodies are totally demilitarized. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used by all states parties to the treaty exclusively for peaceful purposes. If peaceful purposes is normally intended as non-aggressive, exclusively for peaceful purposes is normally intended as non-military. And anyway, this is clarified by what follows, where you find the list of activities that are prohibited: establishment of military bases, testing of any types of weapons, conduct of military maneuvers. It is only specified that the use of military personnel for scientific research or any other peaceful purposes shall not be prohibited, and this is due to which reason? What is the reason of this provision? Yes, but why specifically? It was specifically provided that the use of military personnel is not prohibited. Yes, please. Yes, exactly. Most astronauts are military personnel. Astronauts or cosmonauts, as they are called by the Russians, or taikonauts, I think, as they are called by the Chinese. Anyway, they are normally military personnel. And but this second paragraph of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty has to be interpreted
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. What I was saying now, if you didn't hear only my last sentence, or was it a long time you couldn't hear me?
Like 30 seconds or something.
Okay. Well, my last sentence was, anyway, I was saying the second paragraph of the Moon, of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty shall be interpreted in the sense of total demilitarization of the Moon and other celestial bodies, while there is only a partial demilitarization of the orbits around the Earth. I was saying also that there are some attempts sometimes to try to defend the lawfulness of some military uses of celestial bodies, which would not be prohibited, but this is not in conformity with the text of the second paragraph of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. Okay, there was a question here from the... Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So please, when you don't hear my voice anymore, say it immediately so I can put it in order. Therefore, we may say that the Outer Space Treaty does not prohibit anti-satellite weapons in particular. There is no prohibition of using weapons which would be launched from Earth or from outer space or from anywhere to destroy a satellite. Of course, these weapons cannot use nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons, but they can use conventional weapons. You can use laser weapons to destroy another satellite. These rules do not prohibit anti-ballistic missiles weapons installed in outer space. There was a treaty, a bilateral treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union concluded in 1972. It was called the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, which prohibited the two superpowers to install anti-ballistic missile systems. There was the famous system projected by US President Ronald Reagan, and then other subsequent anti-ballistic missile systems projected both by the United States and by the Soviet Union, or by Russia subsequently. Anyway, the United States have denounced the ABM Treaty in 2002 after 9/11, and therefore they have withdrawn from the treaty, and the treaty is extinct, is dead. The treaty is not existing anymore. So we may say that today there are no more limits of installing, even possibly installing, anti-ballistic missile systems in outer space, and not only in other areas. All this is connected to a very important phenomenon, which is not only connected to military activities, but also to civilian activities, and which is the problem of debris, because the raise in space activities has caused caused a huge problem of production of fragments of space objects and dead space objects, dead satellites. So there are dead satellites and fragments of satellites caused by different reasons, by, for example, collisions or explosions of satellites or other kinds of accidents, or the release of objects in outer space, which causes a huge presence of debris. Debris means all the dead satellites plus the fragments of space objects which are present in outer space, in Earth orbit in particular. And the debris is a threat. It is a threat for the falling of debris onto Earth, but it is specifically a big threat for the conduct of space activities, because the debris may collide with active satellites and damage them or destroy them. So it is a huge problem today, a problem of environmental protection in outer space, because this is a phenomenon of pollution. The debris, the big production of debris is an important phenomenon of pollution of the orbits. Unfortunately, the Outer Space Treaty only contains extremely general principles relating to the protection of outer space. Some more specific guidelines have been adopted by UN Corpus. The UN Corpus is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which has been established by the General Assembly of the United Nations as a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, and it is the body in charge with the production of all standards and all rules applicable to outer space activities. In 2007, the Corpus adopted a set of guidelines on the prevention and reduction of debris. So, for example, recommending states to deorbit a satellite when the satellite is no more functioning. So you can deorbit, so bringing it back to Earth, or you can eject it onto a higher orbit according to where the satellite is, in order not to pollute outer space, not to fill out of space of all those dead objects. However, these guidelines are not binding. States are no more able to agree on binding regulations, and this is due to the fact that especially some big powers, like the United States, do not want to be constrained by further binding regulations. This is true for outer space, but also for other sectors of human activities. And also other big powers would not like to be constrained by binding rules. Now, this problem is very much topical because I don't know how to. Okay. No. This does not stay clear. I don't know what I have to do. Anyway, you have probably heard about this fact that happened just a few hours ago, when Russia sent a missile against a Russian satellite to destroy this Russian satellite. And so it was an anti-satellite missile test with a new kind of anti-satellite missile used by Russia in this occasion. It is not the first anti-satellite test. Russia and China and the United States have done various anti-satellite tests along the years. There was already a famous anti-satellite test conducted by China in 2007, which caused a big outcry in the international community, because China was accused in that case of producing a huge quantity of debris as a consequence of that explosion. And the same has happened now with this Russian anti-satellite test, because the United States have accused Russia of producing dangerous consequences in terms of the production of debris through this test. There have even been plans of evacuation of the International Space Station, because it was felt at a certain moment that the debris caused by this test could be a danger for a collision with the International Space Station, which is an inhabited, as you know, very important, the most important multinational cooperation activity conducted in space, in Earth orbit. And so this is, Russia is denying, of course, that any danger is caused by its experiment, by its test, but the United States, which have the most powerful system of observation of what is taking place in orbit, they have accused Russia of this. Okay, do you have any question? Of course, we are analyzing space issues in an extremely concentrated way, in an extremely rapid way. Do you have any question? Any question at home? Okay, so let us consider the Arctic. The Arctic is mainly sea. Therefore, it is regulated by the law of the sea. The coastal states, as you know, Canada, Norway, Russia, claim sovereignty over all the land territories in the Arctic. Although this sovereignty in this case is special, because it is in many cases not based on effective control, because we are talking about totally icy lands, which are sometimes not effectively controlled by the states in question. But anyway, we may say that all the land territories are under the sovereignty of one or the other of these states. There are sometimes overlapping claims of sovereignty, and there are overlapping claims over the continental shelf, including the North Pole, because the North Pole would be on the continental shelf of one of these states. It has been claimed by Russia, but I think also by other of these states. And these claims have not been, these overlapping claims have not been solved yet. You know that with climate change, there is a huge, unfortunately, a huge potential of resource exploitation. Oil and other resources could be extracted from the continental shelves below the Arctic Sea. Apart from the other exploitation, which is the communication ways, the so-called North Route, crossing the Arctic Sea for the ships. But the most particular, we find the most special regime in Antarctica. Antarctica is a very special case because it is a continent, as you know, and you probably also heard that some countries are claiming sovereignty over the different regions of Antarctica. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, and Norway, and the United Kingdom are claiming sovereignty over different portions of Antarctica. However, these sovereignty claims have been opposed by most of the other states. According to most of the other states, Antarctica is not subject to national appropriation. Antarctica is an international area which is not subject to national appropriation. The question was not solved by the Antarctic Treaty. The Antarctic Treaty is an important treaty adopted in 1959 by all the main states operating in Antarctica. Both those claiming sovereignty and the other states opposing these sovereignty claims. And the Antarctic Treaty establishes a regime which in fact internationalizes the exploration and use of Antarctica, and it is based on a substantial, not taking position and not prejudicing the question of sovereignty. Because according to Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty, nothing contained in the treaty shall be interpreted as renunciation of any claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica, or prejudicing the position of all those parties which do not recognize the sovereignty claims over Antarctica. So the treaty just leaves the question of sovereignty open. But the treaty, so no activities taking place in Antarctica may constitute a basis for asserting or denying claims to sovereignty in Antarctica. And as I mentioned, the treaty provides for an internationalization of activities taking place there. It is in fact also part of a set of treaties. There is the so-called Antarctic System, The Antarctic Treaty provides that Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. In fact, the many provisions of the Antarctic Treaty have been used by the drafters of the outer space treaties. They have been copied for outer space. There is freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica and international cooperation. Some scientific bases, stations have been established in Antarctica in cooperation between different states. For example, there is an French-Italian basis station in Antarctica. There are also some national stations. There is the prohibition of any nuclear explosions, not only military, but also other nuclear explosions in Antarctica, and the disposal of radioactive waste. The treaty also establishes a sort of international organization because the states that are more involved in the activities in Antarctica are named as the consultative powers, so they meet regularly, and they have normative powers. They can establish rules on how the Antarctic activities have to be conducted. They can inspect activities taking place in Antarctica. So there is a system of inspections. And very importantly, there had been a treaty, the Wellington Treaty, which had been concluded to provide for the exploitation of resources in Antarctica. However, that treaty did not enter into force, and it was superseded by the Madrid Protocol of 1991, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, which designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, and it prohibits any activity relating to mineral resources. A possible review of this treaty will take place after 50 years, but which means that at least for 50 years, it has been prohibited to start activities entailing the exploitation of the mineral resources of Antarctica. So this is a very important regime from the point of view of environmental protection, although environmental protection is not perfect even in Antarctica, because, for example, in Antarctica there are more and more tourist activities taking place, and these tourist activities are not certainly beneficial for the preservation of the environment of the Antarctic continent and surrounding waters. Some of the conventions belonging to the Antarctic system are protecting also the waters surrounding the Antarctic continent and the animal species which inhabit those waters. Okay, any question? This is, it has to be mentioned, the fact that this treaty is a sort of atypical situation, because this treaty is binding, of course, on the states parties to the treaty, but one cannot say that the internationalization regime of Antarctica has a universal validity. universal application because not all states are parties to this treaty. So a state which is not bound by this treaty could claim that the Antarctic regime, so this internationalization regime, is not binding under customary international law. And therefore, one state could go there and claim, for example, that it has the right of exploiting the resources of Antarctica because the Madrid Protocol is not binding on it, and therefore could claim it could conduct the activities which are prohibited by the Madrid Protocol. But until today, fortunately, all the states interested in the exploration and exploitation of Antarctica have participated in the Antarctic Treaty, or in the Antarctic system. Any question? Okay, so we are going just to start what is our next issue, and we will continue tomorrow, which is the issue, very topical issue of environmental protection and climate change. The international environmental law is a very special sector of international law because it is a very large sector because it includes a large quantity of international conventions dealing with the most various topics, from the protection of animals to the protection of certain areas, to the prohibition of the emission of certain dangerous substances, etc., etc. And it is also a rather confusing sector of international law in which it is difficult to find proper binding rules and principles. Many norms belonging to this system, to the international environmental law, are formulated in quite vague and ambiguous terms, resulting as a compromise between very different positions among the different states. Anyway, we can say, first of all, that the formation of international environmental law is recent, fairly recent. We find some precedents in the first decades of the 20th century. In particular, tomorrow, one of your colleagues will present to you a famous case, which is the Trail Smelter arbitration between the United States and Canada, which we may say probably the first important case of international environmental law. But after this case, we may say that the real start of international environmental law was with the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which was convened in Stockholm in 1972, which conference issued an important declaration, the Stockholm Declaration, on the Human Environment, which is the first important international document of international environmental law. And the interesting fact, but not a fact which is not a casual fact, is the fact that the declaration is not a treaty. It is a non-binding document. It is a recommendation. It has the value of a recommendation, as all declarations adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations or by multilateral conferences when, of course, a treaty is not adopted, but merely a declaration of principles. Anyway, this Stockholm Declaration contains a very important principle which is considered to belong today to customary international law, even though not everybody would agree with this, but the prevailing opinion is that today this principle, proclaimed in Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration, belongs to customary international law, and it is the prohibition of transboundary environmental damage, the prohibition on states to cause transboundary pollution. States have the sovereign right to exploit their own resources, and this is always clearly proclaimed, but they have the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control, so not only state activities, but also private activities which take place under the jurisdiction or control of a state, do not cause damage, transboundary damage, which means two different things. On one side, damage to the environment of other states, which will often be neighboring states, but also damage, environmental damage to areas beyond the limits of national jurisdictions. Which means what? What does it mean? Areas beyond the limits. What are the areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction? You are now in a condition to reply to this question. Please. Exactly. The high seas, the airspace above the high seas, outer space, all these are areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Which other area could be an area beyond the limits of national jurisdiction? Depending on the position one takes. We have just talked about that. Antarctica. If you take the position that no claim of sovereignty is admissible in Antarctica, which is the prevailing position in the international community, then also Antarctica is an area beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. So there is a prohibition on states to conduct activities which are such as to cause pollution of the environment of other states, in particular, but not only neighboring states, because sometimes the pollution travels all around the globe, so it is not necessarily neighboring states. And there is a prohibition to conduct activities polluting areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. However, you understand how this principle is extremely general. So when is this principle violated? In fact, we may say that most of the activities taking place under the jurisdiction of all states are polluting. They are polluting the environment of other states, and they are polluting areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Just think of the air pollution. There is even a convention on transboundary air pollution that tries to limit the transboundary air pollution, but transboundary air pollution is taking place all the time. So it is difficult to say when the level is reached where you are violating, where a state is violating this general principle. There may be clear situations in which an activity is taking place in one state and it is clearly polluting the territory of a neighboring state, where this provision is clearly violated. But there are other cases in which the polluting activities are conducted by all states and in fact, by all individuals or companies. And it is difficult to state in this case where is the threshold which would cause a violation of this principle. Anyway, this is, we may say, the foundation of international environmental law, the prohibition to pollute the territory of other states or areas beyond national jurisdiction, which means there is no prohibition in international environmental law to pollute your own territory. There is no prohibition on states in relation to activities which merely cause the pollution of the territory of that state. It is only the transboundary pollution which is prohibited. And this prohibition was confirmed in a very important further conference which took place in Rio de Janeiro 20 years later, the UN Conference on Environment and Development. That conference produced, inter alia, the Convention on Climate Change, but we will talk about that later on, and it produced another very important declaration, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, according to which states, you see the formulation is the same as the formulation of Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration, with the only addition of developmental policies. States have the right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental and developmental policies. Because the Rio Conference was the occasion in which environment and development were joined together to form the concept of sustainable development. But we will come back to this tomorrow. Any question? Okay, then thank you very much for today, and we will see each other tomorrow morning to talk about the environmental issues and climate change.